Hello, fellow readers and readeresses. Today, we shall be taking a closer look to the book that holds the secrets to the cosmere and is the inspiration for the name of this channel. Now, before we begin, I have two cats that are both 4 months old and have a specific affinity towards distraction. So if you're hearing noises, do not be alarmed. The world isn't ending. It's just them making sure that I don't have too many possessions. Arcanum Unbounded is a collection of short and not so short stories by the one and only Brandon Sanderson. No offense to John Gwynn and Robin Hobb. It specifically focuses on the cosmere, which is a fictional shared universe between several of Brandon Sanderson's books. So if you haven't yet begun reading it, I would advise you to put a few cosmere books under your belt before you do so. This will ensure that you fully grasp the meaning of a lot of the stories and a lot of the information that you're being conveyed, and also won't spoil some of the fun of reading those cosmere books. And trust me, there's a lot of fun to be had. The Arcanum, as I will be calling it henceforth, I don't know if that's a word, contains 9 stories from 6 different worlds within the cosmere: Selish System, Kaidrian System, Taldan System, Trinodai System, Dramanet System, and Rosharan System. I don't know if I'm pronouncing any of those names right, mind you, and there will be a lot of name butchering most likely within this video, so please have mercy on my soul. This book is split into sections which are world-based. In the beginning of each section, the world or system is introduced to us by one Lady Chris, which is herself a cosmere character, and if you have read White Sand, you are familiar with her. The introduction is done in the form of what I assume are journal entries by Lady Chris, where she describes her findings of the universe, which are never full because she herself is at this moment discovering the cosmere as we are. I'm not gonna lie, I absolutely adore this formatting of the book, and I think these journal entries are some of the best ways to introduce the world and drop some exposition without it being too intrusive. After each short story, you will find a postscript from the author where he describes the process and or inspiration for writing these short stories. Occasionally, you might find some hints for the future involvement of some characters and their importance to the cosmere. I highly recommend you read those postscripts. In fact, anywhere you find writing in this book, read it. I don't think it will be a waste of time. And before we dive into the stories themselves, I wanted to outline 2 other things that made a very good impression on me. Number 1 is illustrations. On the back of the title page of each short story, you will find an illustration that represents a very important key moment from the story itself. And then each chapter has a nice little one under the chapter number, which is kind of typical for Brandon Sanderson's books and is usually related to the investiture of the system. Additionally, each section page has on its back an illustration of the system itself. Maybe this isn't too impressive to some of you, but I always appreciate the extra effort put into the book formatting. And then on the title page of each story, you will find a warning that's letting you know which books might be spoiled by reading this book. It's a little detail, but I highly appreciated it. Now let's move on to the stories themselves. We begin with the Selish Planetary System. The system contains 4 known planets: Dawn, Sel, Kai, and Rallan, and 1 unnamed dwarf planet, all of which orbit the system star Mache. It's very suiting that this is the first system represented because Elantris, Sanderson's first published novel, is set here on Sel, effectively marking the beginning of the cosmere publishing journey. This section contains 2 stories, the first of which is The Emperor's Soul. This is the longest story in this book and is technically a novella which you can purchase and read separately if you prefer. You don't have to have read Elantris to read this one, but I still highly recommend it. It would make the story way more intriguing, as well as the magic system, and serve to expand a world you're already somewhat familiar with. This is a story of a young woman with some very special skills who gets herself into trouble and then has to work hard to get out of it while avoiding certain demise. This was my favorite story. It's so impressive how Sanderson has managed to pack so much growth and intrigue in so few pages. I love the main character. I hope I see her someday again somewhere in the cosmere. And if you've read Elantris, I highly recommend you check out this one as well. I would give it a 5 star. The second story is The Hope of Elantris. For this one, obviously, you have to have read Elantris first. It's one of the shortest stories in the book, only about 20 pages or so, and it follows some of the background characters during the climax of the main novel. This was my favorite story. I found it utterly cute, and there was a few moments where I kind of got choked up because of the found family aspect. It didn't reveal anything profound about the cosmere or self for that matter, but I still very much enjoyed it and I would highly recommend reading it. Especially after reading the postscript and the author's explanation of how he came up with the inspiration for the character, I thought it was absolutely cute. I would give this one 4 stars. And then we move on to the Kaidrian System. The system revolves around an unnamed star from the Awakener constellation. It consists of 5 planets: Skaedriel, which houses the Mistborn series and is the namesake of the system, 2 gas giants, Agal Nod and Agal Uk, and 2 unnamed dwarf planets on the outskirts of the system. This section contains 3 short stories, all obviously related to Mistborn. The first of which is the 11th Metal. It follows Kelsier prior to the beginning of the Mistborn series. It technically can be read without reading Mistborn, but I'm not sure that it will be enjoyed as much without the main story, because the reader would have no context about the motivations of those characters, plus there is a bit of a reveal about Kelsier's companion that will make no sense to those who aren't familiar with the big bad of Mistborn Era 1. So I would still advise to read all the way through the Hero of Ages and then come back to read this one. This was my favorite story. I quite liked it, though I was hoping the whole time through reading it to get some more, which is kind of difficult when the story is only about 20 pages. Still, it did its job, and as I already mentioned prior, it did reveal a pretty big chunk of information as to who and how exactly set Kelsier's grand plan into motion. I would give this one 3.5 stars. And then we have Allomancer Jack and the Pits of Eltania, episodes 28th through 30th. Now this story contains spoilers for Mistborn Era 2, and since I sadly have not read through it yet, I skipped it. Which is why I don't have much to say about this one, besides I think it's the shortest story in the collection. And then we have the crown jewel of the Arcanum, in my humble opinion, Mistborn Secret History. This one is also technically a novella marked as number 3.5 in the Mistborn series, so it definitely requires you to have read Era 1 before it. The warning also states that it contains mild spoilers for Mistborn Era 2, but I decided to risk it, and I'm not sorry, so read at your own discretion.
This was my favorite story.
It follows a very prominent character from the Final Empire who doesn't appear in the other 2 books from Era 1. We get to see them through the events of the Well of Ascension and the Hero of Ages and the things they've gotten themselves into in the meantime. This, in my opinion, is the juiciest story in the Arcanum because it gives out the most details about the cosmere, and I believe this is the first time, at least in a book form, that we find out exactly what are the forces that kind of move the universe. I will not give any more details because I don't wish to spoil you, but if you read nothing else from the Arcanum, I think you should read this story. You will not be disappointed. And one more thing, as I already mentioned earlier, technically it's only necessary to have read Mistborn Era 1 to read this one, but in order to fully appreciate the magnitude of the information that you're receiving and to build up anticipation and love for the cosmere, I would advise you to read through Elantris, Warbreaker, and Stormlight Archive up to and including Oathbringer in order to really fully appreciate what is going on here. I think it's best when you receive secrets like this to have had the opportunity to theorize about them prior to it. In my personal opinion, that gives out the most pleasure. I will give this one 5 stars. And then we move on to the Taldan System. Now this one is very interesting, both cosmologically and otherwise. This is a binary system with 2 stars. A white dwarf surrounded by a dense cloud of particles, and a blue-white supergiant. Now, unrelated, but if you know anything about astrophysics, you will know that the blue stars are the one with the highest class of luminosity and size. Locked between those two is the only planet in the system, Taldan. This is where the only story of this section takes place, which is coincidentally, to my knowledge, the only graphic novel in the cosmere. White Sand, which consists of 3 volumes as of now. This is, as I already mentioned earlier, the place where our guide through the Arcanum, Lady Chris, comes from. Unfortunately, a standard book formatting is not the best place for a graphic novel of 3 volumes to be housed, which is why only a little part of the first volume is included here, as well as a first version of the prologue written by Brandon Sanderson. So to fully appreciate it, I would advise you to acquire the 3 volumes separately and read it that way. You don't have to have read anything from the cosmere in order to read this one, but I would advise you not to start here because in my personal opinion, this is not the best the cosmere has to offer, and I'm worried you will be disappointed before you get to the good part. That's not to say that the graphic novel isn't good. I actually quite enjoyed it, although the initial art style wasn't entirely by my taste, but I think without a nugget of knowledge about the cosmere, you won't fully appreciate the magic system and what you're seeing. I would give this one 3 to 3.5 stars. And then we move on to the Trinodai System. This system houses 4 planets, 3 of which, Monodi, Elegi, and Trinodi, are similar in size and orbit closer to the system star and to each other, while the 4th one, Purity, is way bigger than them and orbits much farther on the outskirts. Some pretty messy stuff has happened in this system cosmere-wise. I won't say more about that. There's only one story in this section, Shadows for Silence in the Forests of Hell. I mean, how cool is that name? It happens on Trinodai, though Purity is mentioned in the local lore, I believe. By the way, this is where Lady Chris's companion comes from. She has a companion, I don't think I mentioned that. This was my favorite story. Now, I know I've said that for every story so far, but this might be it actually. It had one of the coolest worlds and some of the most interesting characters, period. I am so impressed by how much Sanderson has managed to pack in here. I will not tell you much more because the story is not very long, and part of the surprise is who it will end up following after the initial introductory part. You can read this story without reading anything else from the cosmere, and this is the one time I will refrain from advising otherwise because the story is absolutely lovely on its own and is complete enough to excite you about the cosmere and Sanderson's writing in general. And if you can believe it, George R. R. Martin was the catalyst for the creation of this story. I would give it 5 stars. Next is the Dramanet System. Now, Dramanet is actually a nickname, as the real name of the system, if there is such, is unknown. The planet closest to the system star is first of the Sun, with its moon first of the first. Then we have second of the Sun, and that goes all the way to the 7th of the Sun. By the way, doesn't the system somewhat remind you of our solar system, albeit a planet short and a little bit scrambled? The only story in this section is 6th of the Dusk and is happening on the 1st of the Sun. The story follows the trapper 6th of the Dusk and his birds. That is a terrible summary, but I absolutely don't want to spoil it for you.
This was my favorite story.
Technically, there is no need to read anything else before you read this one, but I will advise you to read through the Stormlight Archive all the way up to and including Dawn Shard. And not because they're strictly related per se, but I found myself thinking about Stormlight whilst reading this and theorizing heavily. I would give this one 4.5 stars. And speaking of the Stormlight Archive, the last section of the Arcanum is the Rosharan System. This is the system with the most planets in the Arcanum, 13. The system also has an asteroid belt and 3 moons, so a total of 16 orbiting bodies. 16, an important number, wouldn't you say? You will understand after reading Secret History. The system is named after Roshar, which is the planet second closest to the star. This is where the Stormlight Archive happens, which makes it automatically my favorite planet in the cosmere. The section contains only one story by the name of Edge Dancer. It follows Lift, who appears in the Stormlight Archive, and you need to read all the way through Words of Radiance in order to get to this one. This, sadly, was my least favorite story of the Arcanum, and for one reason only. I just can't stand Lift as a character. And look, I don't mind following younger protagonists, but I will go as far as to say that this is the worst Sanderson's character work by far. What do I mean by that? She's an annoying Mary Sue. That's it. She's somehow better than anyone at everything while being absolutely disrespectful to everyone she meets. Moreover, the way she thinks, speaks, and acts is somehow inappropriately comedic, which creates a tonal inconsistency to the Stormlight Archive. I mean, look, I know that Shallan is also a jokester, but it is represented in a completely different way and is followed by moments where she's humble as well. And it's such a shame because Lift's storyline has the potential to be very, very interesting. But it annoys me how much Sanderson is letting her get away with. And even before I read the postscript of this story, I could already tell that she's one of his favorite characters. And it's never a good thing when you can pinpoint the author's favorite, right? Anyway, I still think the story is worth reading, and you maybe won't have the same aversion to the protagonist as I did. I would give this one 3 stars. And that concludes the Arcanum Unbounded, and subsequently this video. I hope this was useful for you, and whether you read the book or not, I'd be happy to hear what you think and chat about it. As always, any comments about my terrible hair would be highly appreciated. Thank you for sparing the time to endure my yapping, and I wish you all the leeward side of the hill. Did you know that if you like this video and subscribe to this channel, you will live longer and therefore be able to read more books?